Is Irenaeus reliable? This is an important question because a lot of the information you'll see on the internet about figures like Simon of Samaria, Marcion, Valentinus, and Vesalides can all be traced back to Irenaeus. Irenaeus can even be credited with giving us the rudimentary category that we now call Gnosticism, a network of ideas and figures that did not belong together prior to a genealogy traced by Irenaeus running from Simon to Tatian. For those of you who don't know him, Irenaeus was a Christian leader in Lyon, with key connections in Rome and Asia Minor, where he was born. Between about 180 and 189, he wrote a 5-volume work called The Refutation and Overthrow of Gnosis Falsely So Called, aka Against Heresies. In this session, I limit the discussion of Irenaeus' reliability to Book 1 of Against Heresies. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and on this channel we explore topics from the Greco-Roman world, early Christianity, and Gnostic studies. It's my joy to provide free content. To do this, I depend entirely on your support. So please consider supporting me on Patreon, making a one-time donation, or by taking one of my many courses, like Introducing Marcion, the Hermetica, and Redating the Gospels. Eventually, all my courses will be available to you on a single subscription called the Gnosis Academy. Being part of this academy includes a monthly hangout with me, so join and introduce yourself to me personally. Links are in the description. Let's begin with some general points. Scholars have long used and trusted Irenaeus' report on the system of Ptolemy the Valentinian in the first section of Against Heresies, Book 1. Clearly, Irenaeus had a source, and although this source does not survive, it seems that Irenaeus, apart from many snide comments, reported it with some basic accuracy. We know from surviving sources that Valentinians did teach about paired aeons or eternities in a divine phonos or pleroma, although they never seem to have agreed on a consistent storyline. So in general, we must state that writing in the late 2nd century, Irenaeus had a source which we no longer have, and we should listen to him attentively. At the same time, Irenaeus was far from being an objective reporter. He distorted information in more subtle ways by reframing the data in a pseudo-history of heresies. He did not check his sources, and so he often reported baseless rumors. Both in overall structure and in some individual details, Irenaeus was not accurate in his reporting. This means that although we can never dismiss him, we should never trust him outright. When judging Irenaeus' reliability, we should keep several specific points in mind. First of all, Irenaeus did not cite the sources of his information. This is important because scholars think that Irenaeus basically took over an earlier heresy catalog written and transmitted by Justin Martyr. But Irenaeus never tells his readers about this particular source. Thus, he never tells us what information he inherits from this catalog or others and what he changes, adds, or adapts. Even if this procedure is not unusual in ancient times, it raises many questions and concerns about the quality of Irenaeus' data. Irenaeus was neither a scholar nor a journalist. He did not go directly to Basilidean or Carpocratian Christians. He discovered what he thought were their texts and reported on their doctrines. Or he just used older reports based on hearsay, transmitting them and tweaking them as he went along. Secondly, Irenaeus focused mainly on his opponents' doctrines. He generally ignored their social contexts, their underlying logic, their experiences, and their biographies. He was not trying to understand them, but to expose them. What Irenaeus related, moreover, was often what he considered to be the weirdest and most questionable aspects of their doctrine. He made it seem as if the first thing you would learn in Ptolemy's school is the story about 30 paired aeons. But Ptolemy, in his surviving letter to Flora, never mentions these aeons. His more advanced teachings, in other words, were not meant for beginners, but for mature students of an inner circle. Irenaeus ignored a basic structure of ancient education that one only tells certain teachings to higher initiates. This is why Hermetic teaching looks so different depending on which treatise you're reading. The treatises are all aimed at people at distinct levels of initiation. Irenaeus' focus solely on doctrine allowed him to contaminate and assimilate reports on various figures so that the creeds of his opponents increasingly looked alike. Accordingly, figures who did not originally teach the same doctrines are presented as teaching something similar. The doctrine, for instance, that angels created the world is attributed to several figures, including Simon of Samaria, Basilides, Carpocrates, and others. But when we look at the primary sources for these figures, they never mention it. Irenaeus also consistently accuses his opponents of using magic, perhaps because he believed that every ritual of which he disapproved was magical, or perhaps because this was such a standard charge to throw at one's opponents. But perhaps the most important criticism of Irenaeus regards his overall framework. In short, he groups together diverse figures into a big tent category of heretics, going back to Simon of Samaria in the age of the apostles. This artificial attempt to group diverse figures based on intellectual genealogy results in distortions that are still very much with us today. All the figures belong to different areas of the empire, and they lived in slightly different times. But due to a perceived similarity in their teachings, Irenaeus thought that he could connect them, whether as co disciples or as masters and disciples. He had a rough idea of which figures were earlier and later. So, if figures like Simon and Menander were perceived as teaching similar things in roughly the same area, they could be connected as teacher and student, even if in actual fact they weren't. A good example here is Cerdo and Marcion. Cerdo did live and teach in Rome when Marcion arrived there, and he seems also to have distinguished the true God from the Creator, but the inference that Cerdo was Marcion's teacher is not reliable or historical. It's a connection made by Irenaeus, and it's based on his desire to link figures in an unholy communion. Figures who lived in a similar place with similar teachings must have been connected intellectually. Prior to the Nag Hammadi discovery and the collection of fragments from Basilides, Valentinus, and others, fact checking Irenaeus was either not possible or extremely difficult. Scholars, especially conservative ones, tended to trust Irenaeus if there was no disconfirming evidence. In our day, however, we can, in many cases, check Irenaeus's reports, and in many of these cases, his individual points prove to be inaccurate. The fact that Irenaeus's reports selectively overlap with material found at Nag Hammadi is indisputable. The most famous case here is the overlap of Against Heresies 1, chapter 29, with the story of God in the secret book of John. At the same time, overlap does not always mean strict accuracy. There are important differences, for instance, between Against Heresies 129 and the secret book of John, at least as we know it. The first and most noticeable difference is that Irenaeus' version lacks the secret book of John's introduction, featuring the Apostle John, an opposing Pharisee, and the revelatory appearance of Jesus. This apostolic framework, in other words, is completely missing. Irenaeus' report also apparently lacked the latter half of the story of salvation, which talked about the paradise story, the creation of Adam and Eve, the birth of Seth, the salvation of earthly humanity, John's 10 questions posed to Jesus about salvation, and so on. If Irenaeus omitted this material, he was certainly not telling the full story of the secret book of John. The secret book in Codex 3 presents roughly the same initial story of God with many of the same characters as in Against Heresies 129, but key differences emerge. In the secret book, there's a much larger section of negative theology describing the Father and more glorifying epithets bestowed on Barbello. The eternities, according to the secret book, do not form pairs. They do not have children. They engage more thoroughly in liturgical praise of the Father in Barbelo. In the secret book, Christ and the self-born, aka autogenes, are the same character, although they are different in Irenaeus' report. The names of the four lights are also different. Raguel becomes Oriel in the secret book. David becomes Davitha. Adamas in the secret book does not marry perfect Gnosis, and together they do not produce the tree of Gnosis. The four lights of the secret book are associated with 12 eternities, not four faculties. They house Adamas, Seth, the seed of Seth, and the late repenters, but Irenaeus never mentions these repenters or Seth or his seed. According to the secret book, wisdom does not lack a partner. Wisdom never descends to the level of the creator, and she never retreats back upward. The creator in the secret book receives the name Yaldabaoth and Saklos, along with a luminous cloud and a bestial form. He also makes named authorities and angels in numerical patterns. The archontic names and numbers are completely missing from Irenaeus' report, and these differences are substantial. Even if one determines that Irenaeus faithfully transmitted the gist of his sources, that does not mean he was accurate in presenting all the details. And even if he was in some respects considered thorough, he did not necessarily tell the whole story, and he ignored the context of many stories. In discerning Irenaeus' overall accuracy, one must also take into account cases in which Irenaeus' testimony stands in tension with Nag Hammadi materials. In my view, Nag Hammadi and related literature does not, in the main, confirm Irenaeus' claims about a second baptism that is sponsored by Valentinians. It does not confirm that Irenaeus' opponents were libertines or sexually immoral. It does not confirm Irenaeus' genealogizing method, that is, tracing all opposing sects back to Simon, making Saturninus and Vassilides students of Menander, and so on. On points of detail, let's take the case of Vassilides. In my book on Vassilides, I list the teachings ascribed to him by Irenaeus that are not confirmed or are contradicted by the authentic fragments of Vassilides. Let's look at some of these contradictions. For instance, Irenaeus says the following about Vassilides' beliefs. Very famously, he says that there are 365 heavens, and that these heavens were all made by angels. In my view, this report is contradicted by Vassilides' fragment 11, which mentions an Ogdoad of Vassilides. And in this Ogdoad are figures like justice and peace. If this Ogdoad refers to an eighth sphere, and if divine entities live in this eighth sphere, then presumably there are not 365 heavens dividing our world from the divine sphere. Importantly, Irenaeus never mentions an Ogdoad in reference to Vassilides. If he knew of it, he surely would have connected the doctrine of Vassilides and Valentinus, or Ptolemy, on a primal Ogdoad of 8 aeons. But in fragment 11, Vassilides says not that there was an Ogdoad of 8 aeons, but that justice and peace dwell in the Ogdoad. The language assumes that the Ogdoad is a place, namely the eighth sphere. As I've discussed in previous videos, Irenaeus claims that for Vassilides, Christ does not suffer on the cross. Rather, it was Simon of Cyrene, and so one need not confess the crucified. But this tradition is contradicted by fragment 1, where Vassilideans are said to date the crucifixion with precision. If they did not teach that Jesus was crucified, they would not have tried to date the event of the crucifixion. Therefore, something must seriously be wrong with Irenaeus' report. He probably did not completely make up information, but he wrongly attributed a particular story of the crucifixion to Vassilides, a story that survives elsewhere. Irenaeus claims that for Vassilides, prophecies are uttered by angelic rulers. If this implies that the prophecies are not true, then this is contradicted by fragment 15. In this fragment, Isidore, the son of Vassilides, clearly assumes that the prophecies are true and that they are the uncited sources for philosophers. In short, the philosophers gained access to truth by reading the prophets. Furthermore, Irenaeus claims that, according to Basilides, practicing lustful acts is something indifferent. This point is likely contradicted by the sexual ethics of Fragment 6, where Isidore calls people to be rational eunuchs who inherit God's eternal kingdom. This implies that sexual abstinence was valued in Basilides' community. Basilides himself directly condemned lust in Fragment 7, saying that it is equivalent to adultery. Here he agrees perfectly with the saying of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. According to Irenaeus, Basilideans are ready to recant when they are arrested as Christians, but this report is contradicted by Fragment 7, where Basilides approves of martyrdom and assumes that Christians nobly die as, he says, natural Christians. Basilides sees martyrdom as part of a grand scheme of providence, and Basilides would say anything rather than deny providence. Of 14 points mentioned by Irenaeus about Basilides, 9 of them are not confirmed by anything in the fragments, unless they depend solely on the testimony of Irenaeus. But the 5 points which we mentioned are likely contradicted by material in the fragments. This means that roughly 36% of the time, Irenaeus' report on Basilides is not accurate, and 64% of the time it is simply unconfirmed. As a whole, then, Irenaeus' report does not inspire anything like simple confidence. At least 1/3 of the time, he was wrong. There are also points in which Irenaeus contradicts himself. He accuses the Carpocratians, for instance, of being licentious and immoral. At the same time, he says that Carpocratians tried to imitate Jesus, who triumphed over his passions, violent emotions like lust and greed. If Carpocratians tried to imitate the passionless Jesus, then they strove against their own passions, including sexual passion. Irenaeus himself could not believe that Carpocratians practiced the crass immoralities of which they were accused, but he chose to report them anyway, to raise feelings of disgust and hostility. On another point, Irenaeus is inconsistent. Despite the supposedly Carpocratian teaching that one must perform every possible work to be redeemed, Irenaeus never accuses them of trying to commit absolutely every human deed. This is pointed out by Michael Williams. In fact, Irenaeus himself observes that doing every human deed and learning every human art is simply impossible. To sum up, what can we say in general about the reliability of Irenaeus? His reports are almost always secondhand. Sometimes they are unbelievable even to Irenaeus himself. They are full of artificial connections and assimilations, and they are designed for one purpose: to destroy the reputation of his enemies. If Irenaeus in Against Heresies did not engage in intentional misrepresentation, he was certainly capable of significant misinterpretation and negative reframing of his sources. In short, despite his generally good reputation among some patristic scholars, Irenaeus' reports on his Christian enemies cannot be trusted. Every point must be checked against the primary sources we have in our possession. Every report that is unconfirmed must be held with a grain, if not a pound, of salt. And on this score, we can't assume that later heresiologists confirm Irenaeus. In fact, these heresiologists were all dependent on Irenaeus and simply repeat his false accusations, sometimes making them seem even worse. So, if Irenaeus was reliable or is considered reliable on other matters, when it comes to his enemies, he was not.